So over the last few weeks, I have been spending a lot of time reading from the book of Acts. And it's been kind of a joy, which is surprising, but it's been kind of a joy. Much like the joy that comes from meeting an old friend that you haven't seen in a very long time. So you know how it is. You see your old friend and you instantly recognize them, but you also notice that, man, they've changed over the 30 years since I've seen them. And if you talk long enough, you may even come to understand them in new ways, because they've lived a life and you've lived a life, and here you are meeting and talking, and you're different people because of the lives you've lived, and so you come to understand them in different ways. So that has exactly been my experience of rereading the book of Acts. For so many years, I read the stories of the Apostle Paul and the Apostle Peter, two giants in our faith. And as I would read the stories, I would think to myself, wow, they sure have it all together. They're so certain of their beliefs. They have it all figured out. And I would think, and the only thing left for them to do now is to go out and get people to believe what they believed. And I read the book of Acts my whole life, basically that way. But as I have reread this book, I realized that it's not how the author of Acts tells the story. That's not how he tells the story. In fact, if you go to the book of Acts and read it, which I highly recommend, if you go to the book of Acts and read it closely, Peter and Paul were not always sure of their beliefs at all. Now, they came to understand their faith and have profound faith, and they were leaders in the faith, but mostly it was through trial and error that they came to a belief or understanding. They got to see God's patience and grace in their own development. So they weren't the sure, rock-solid, believing people that we might have thought they were, but they were profoundly faithful, and I'm not saying this to diminish them in any way. If you read the book of Acts in one sitting, you see that time and time again, there are wonderful things that happen to people in this book. But the wonderful things are not because of something that Peter and Paul have dutifully planned or organized or set out in a course that people could study necessarily. No, the wonderful things happened because God had already been there working to bring life to the people. So God got there first. And then Peter and Paul just happened to come later and help people make sense of their experience, help them see how this involves God and Christ and Spirit. But they weren't necessarily responsible for making people believe anything. That was the work of the Spirit. Their contribution, which was truly important, was in this helping one another understand, or to see more clearly or more fully, how the Spirit is always working to bring life to a world that is so filled with deathly things, hard things. Which is more about learning to see how Spirit is at work and how to live faith more fully than it is about simply defining the faith. And this living the faith versus defining it is going to be an important distinction for us today, because we're going to dive into the story of Tabitha. But before we can do this, we need to be clear about the difference between what we believe the resurrection of Christ to be and what the living the resurrection, our part in living the resurrection, actually is. They're related, but they're not the same thing. Now, in this room, in each of our hearts, we hold a belief about what the resurrection is and what it is not. Right? And I would imagine that there are as many heart-held beliefs as there are people in this room. And that's okay. That truly is okay. If what you believe about the resurrection positively informs your living and makes your life better and more grace-filled, then it's appropriate. So just to know that what you're holding in your heart is good. Yet what Tabitha's story is inviting us to think about is the how we are living out our belief in the resurrection. Or in other words, how we are living the resurrection. So we heard Bill read the story. There was a disciple named Tabitha who lived in Joppa, and she was an amazing woman. She devoted all of her time and all of her money and all of her life's energy to good works and great acts of charity. She made a real difference in the lives of real people. If they were hungry, she fed them. If they didn't have clothes, she clothed them. If they were friendless, she was their friend. And as the story unfolded, we heard that Tabitha became ill and she died. And we heard how bereft her community was. Her community then cared for her body, laid it on a bed, and hearing that Peter was in the next town over, they sent for him, hoping against hope that he might be able to do something for them or for Tabitha. They didn't know what, but they wanted something done. So when Peter arrives, he finds a community torn apart by their sadness, torn apart by their grief, torn apart by all of that sense of personal loss over the death of this truly remarkable and much beloved person. So amid this great scene of sadness, Peter prays. Peter prays that Tabitha might have new life. And as we heard, Tabitha opens her eyes and she gets up. She has been restored to life. And the story of Tabitha's return to life is told over and over, and many people are drawn to the faith because of this return to life. So the question for us this morning becomes then, what are we to make of this story? Well, we can't simply say that it's a miracle story and leave it at that, because all miracle stories in the Bible, all miracle stories in the Bible contain deeper truth than how or if the divine can overcome the laws of physiology and physics, right? Every miracle story is about the deeper meaning behind God's actions in the world. And we can't make this story about Peter because this story isn't about Peter at all, not even in the smallest sense. We cannot make it only about the need to be kind and generous to others, right? It's not just yet another sermon that says, you know, you should be like Tabitha. Let's go feed and clothe and just leave it at that. It's about that, but it's about more than that as well. If we leave it just in the good works category, then we have moved grace and faith out of the divine realm, that gift of grace, that gift of faith, something that God does. So we've moved good works from that as our response to that grace into more of a works righteousness, where we need to do good things in order to earn God's love. And that is simply not the case. That's not biblical. So we can't just leave it as a call to do good works. So again, what are we to make of this story? Well, truly, this story is all about Tabitha's community. It's all about the community. It's all about the community just like this community. It's about how a community yearned for a different outcome than the one that they saw before their eyes. It's about how a community that from all available evidence really had no reason to hope for a different outcome. They had no reason to hope because the heart of their community, Tabitha, was dead, and what did that mean? They had no real reason to hope. Yet this community still managed to dream that things could be different. Their present reality didn't define who they were or how they saw the world. They did real things. They acted in very specific and positive ways. They called Peter. It's a good start. They gathered Tabitha's good works around them. Another good thing to do. They shared their tears, their sorrow, and their hope that heart of their community might gain new life. So what it all comes down to is that this congregation that lived in Joppa actually lived the resurrection. They trusted the Easter promise that out of death, God promises to bring new life, that God will work to bring new life for all. And while they remained a vulnerable community for sure, and had to face all of the same kinds of death-dealing things that we too have to face, that community stood together. They stood together as people of the resurrection. They lived it. They used all of the tools and spiritual resources available to give to all available tools available to them. They used them all to give new life a chance, right? Anything that was available to them, they used to give new life a chance. Even though they were facing what seemed like the death of the very heart of their community, they didn't stop there. So we too, here, are called to live the resurrection, that to trust that no matter the brokenness in our society that we see, and there's plenty to see, no matter the pain that we suffer in our hearts, no matter the grief we encounter when someone that we love dearly dies, we need to trust that this is not the end of the story. This is not how the story ends. That despite all of the evidence that says our society will always be unjust or cruel or unfair, no, we stand shoulder to shoulder and say, that's just not acceptable to us, right? We want a different outcome. No matter the evidence that says we will always have and hold our own personal pain and sorrow or grief and hold them as our constant companions, we stand with one another and say, that is not the way it has to be. That healing can happen and joy can return. It's not only possible, but it's promised. That's what Easter is. And so we too need to pool all of our tools and our resources and our spiritual gifts, because there is nothing that cannot be overcome. There is nothing that cannot be overcome, healed, and be made new. That's what the story of Tabitha tells us. There's nothing that cannot be overcome when the community stands together. The reason this faith community or our congregation exists is to actually serve the purposes of transformation that the resurrection unleashed upon the world. Christ calls us to be light and love and hope-filled, never settling for less than the wholeness of society, never settling for less than the wholeness of self. So to live the resurrection means where we see hatred, we sow love. Where we see despair, we sing our hope. Where we see darkness, we hold the light that is love. Where there is sadness, we bring joy. Where we see one another struggle or fall, we lend one another a hand to hold, or a shoulder to cry on, or an ear to listen. And we do all of those things for ourselves, and we do all of those things for one another, and we do all of these things for the whole world. Even if the whole world will call us foolish or naive or misguided. We are people of the resurrection, and that's simply who we are. So that is resurrection living. That is what makes us disciples. That is what lies at the center of our faith lives. And that is what's going to change our world. That is what will nurture the heart of both this community as a whole, as well as all of our individual hearts, all of us who come and call this place our faith home. And all we need to do is to remember that the Spirit is alive and at work in all of us, and the Spirit is alive and at work among us. All we need to do is to become the audacious dreamers who will not give in to the despair that the world is so ready to give us. We can't give in to that kind of outlook in our world. We need to become the kind of people who instead desire and work for a different ending to the story, a different outcome, as we dare to live the resurrection. And so, may it be so in your life and in mine. Amen.